So tonight we're going to talk about, we'll start with talking about the science and the dangers, and then we'll go into what's being done already and what needs to be done to really attack this problem before it becomes insurmountable. So I'd like to introduce Thom to get us going.
Thank you. Now, she already let the cat out of the bag as to 350. Just to take a small survey, if you just saw this, how many of you would know what this means?
It's a national.
No.org.
350 parts per million carbon dioxide.
Exactly. So this is the parts per million of carbon dioxide that are safe to have in the atmosphere. And so this is the name of the organization, 350.org, that Bill McKibben, one of the early pioneers of climate work, created. And right now we're at 411 and rising rapidly. So we're way out of the safety zone, which is what we'll be talking about this evening. Can someone kill the light? So I guess I can.
Sorry.
Thanks.
Good job.
So Climate Action Iowa is affiliated with the Climate Reality Project, which is a group that Al Gore created, and a couple of us took training with him. And then 350.org we're also affiliated. And as Mary said, what we're going to do tonight is first talk about the science and the dangers, then the solutions that are already underway, and then what we can do right now. And if you wouldn't mind holding questions to the end, this thing will go a lot quicker, and then we can get to any discussions we want to have. Now, I realize in any group that there are people with different degrees of knowledge and different perspectives and opinions about climate change and what it means for the world, and that's fine. Hopefully, if you just listen and watch, you will find some things that are of interest, regardless of where you're coming from right now. So first, before we get started, just a brief word on the difference between weather and climate. I'm sure you all know, but it's often confused these days. The typical thing is if we have some snowstorms running late into the spring, or it's very cold in the winter, you'll have people, perhaps even our president, saying, yeah, where's the global warming? Which is a very ignorant thing to say, because weather is intrinsically changeable. And when we talk about, it's just the fluctuating waves of our weather, whereas climate is the trend that is going out, changing over time. Now, this is an interesting little graphic about the jet stream. What's happening, and this is one of the reasons we're getting all this crazy weather, is the jet stream, which used to be relatively stable, is getting what they call wavier due to the warming effects in different parts of the world, especially in the Arctic. The jet stream is moving in ways that it wasn't before. And that can bring down this really frigid weather in the winter. It can bring terribly hot weather. It can bring rain and droughts and so forth. This is just one factor going on. So we're not here to scare you, at least not too much. But the point is that the warnings that we're getting from the scientists are getting more and more urgent with every passing month. Now, we're all seeing the effects, or hearing the stories about weather-related, climate-related disasters and suffering around the world, in our own state, in our own country, and all over the world. But the scientists are studying more the macro trends and where we are headed. And they're getting more and more serious about what they're seeing. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is affiliated with the UN, in October of last year, about 100 scientists studied 6,000 climate studies and made their sort of landmark study and projection about where we're headed. The conclusion was that governments around the world must take rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society to avoid truly disastrous consequences. Now look at that sentence and think, how could you make that any more serious? And this is the kind of thing we're getting from all the major scientific bodies. Here in the US, even with the Trump administration, apparently he couldn't find a way to stop it, but the National Climate Assessment happens every X number of years, and it gathers together scientists who study the likely effects on the United States itself. And they came out with their study in November of last year, and it too was very sobering. The summary was that if we continue on our present course, disruptions caused by climate change could cost the US economy $500 billion a year by the end of the century and cause tens of thousands of deaths. That's just in the US, and that's our present course, not considering the fact that emissions are in fact rising. As I said, the science is pretty much nailed at this point. Even Fortune magazine, which is certainly a capitalist-oriented magazine, said in February that the evidence for man-made climate change has reached a gold standard of certainty. So let's talk just briefly about the basic science. Forgive me if you know all this, we'll just go quickly through it. This is the atmosphere of the Earth, obviously, taken from the space station. We ordinarily think of the atmosphere when we look up at the sky as an infinite expanse of blue stuff. But it's hardly infinite. It's extremely thin. And the problem is, what we're doing is dumping 110 million tons of global warming gases into the atmosphere every single day. So this is the basic reality of global warming. The sun's radiation comes through our atmosphere and warms the Earth, which is a very good thing. Some of that energy is radiated back into space, which is good too, because we don't want to warm it up too much. But some of it is reflected back, or it's trapped rather, by the atmosphere and continues to warm the planet further, which is, again, good for us. The problem is, as we increase those greenhouse gases in that layer of atmosphere, more and more energy is trapped and reflects back to the Earth, and that's the cause of global warming. Now, the biggest sources of greenhouse gases are these. We're not going to talk about all of these, but most of them have one thing or another to do with fossil fuels and various greenhouse gases. So, by far the largest source of global warming, pollution, is the burning of fossil fuels. This is a graph going from 1850 to 2018, showing you the steep increase in the emission of CO2. And this is a particular favorite of mine, this graph, because what you see here, this is the 1950 level, this line of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Lots of fluctuation, as you can see, from 400,000 years ago to the present day. You'll hear again a lot from climate questioners or deniers, but the climate's always changing, it's always fluctuating, and it is. Lots of fluctuation there. The problem is, over here, because we have just crossed rapidly to the level of 1950, and we've far exceeded the level of carbon dioxide that has been in the atmosphere for the last 400,000 years. And in fact, the most recent evidence says that CO2 in the atmosphere is now the highest in 3 million years. So we're on a planet that has not existed ever during the time that humans have been on Earth. It's a brand new system.
I made the mistake of thinking that the carbon would float away into space, and it doesn't. It sticks around.
Yeah.
So we just keep pouring it in.
Same reason the oxygen doesn't. If the oxygen floated away, we'd all die too. So no, the gravity keeps it there. Yeah. So we see a similar graph for the increase in global temperatures from 1880 to the present day. A very alarming graph. Now, 18 of the 19 hottest years on record for the world have occurred since 2001. 18 of the 19. And the hottest of all have been the last 5 years. So we're on a trajectory here that is completely unprecedented. 224 locations around the world set all-time heat records in 2018. There are places on Earth that you absolutely wouldn't want to be. In Basra, Iraq, we had 129 degrees, and in Kuwait, over 129 degrees in 2016. In Australia, the temperature reached 121 in southern Australia. These are temperatures, I don't know, maybe in the desert for a little while, but obviously if you're in any kind of area that also has humidity, these are basically unsupportable temperatures. At the North Pole, in February 2018, it was 50 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than normal, which is just absolutely outrageous.
It was 90 degrees in Anchorage a couple days ago.
Yeah. So what does it mean? 31% of the Earth's population currently experiences deadly heat, potentially deadly heat, 20 or more days a year. That's right now. And by the end of the century, they're saying that in the tropics, that would probably persist year-round. And even in mid-latitudes like ours, we could experience 60 days a year of that. There's the New York Times talking about India. Summer heat may soon be literally unbearable. And obviously it's a population of 1.3 billion. In Pakistan in 2015, 1,200 people died in a heat wave, but tens of thousands have died in heat waves in recent years in Europe, Russia, and other countries. We don't hear that much about these harrowing statistics, but they are happening. And who's affected the most by heat? It's the poor and the elderly, infants and children, people with medical conditions, mentally ill, etc. In other words, the most needy among us are the ones who suffer the most, although we all would be suffering under these kind of conditions. But it's not just air temperatures that are rising, the oceans are also warming in a dangerous way. 93% of the extra heat that's trapped by the greenhouse gases goes into our oceans. And so we see this is what's happened to our global ocean temperatures just in the last 50 years. And 2018 was the hottest year on record in the oceans. Over half of the oxygen we breathe comes from these tiny phytoplankton in the oceans, and scientists are studying the likely threat to phytoplankton from the warming and the acidification that goes on because of these processes. Obviously that would be very bad. I mean, that's half of the oxygen, and as you know, a great deal of the other oxygen that supplies us comes from forests, and we have a problem in the rainforests where they're being decimated to make room for crops, soy, and other things. So speaking of warm oceans, Hurricane Harvey in 2017 crossed the Gulf of Mexico waters that were 7 degrees warmer than normal, all the way down to 200 meters deep. And so what happens is, as the land and the oceans warm, the downpours get much bigger. So in Nederland, Texas, during Hurricane Harvey, 5 feet of rainfall fell in a 24-hour period, which is almost impossible to imagine. To give you an idea of what that is, there's Niagara Falls rain. It took 500 days of the total flow of Niagara Falls. That's how much water fell in Louisiana and Texas in 5 days during that storm period. So, and there have been 17 1 in 1,000 year downpours in the US since 2010. You hear these statistics all the time that, oh, there's a 500-year flood in Davenport, and there's a 1,000-year event in Texas. These are happening all the time now. And we've all seen pictures like this. Houston, here's Louisville, Kentucky in 2018. This was Cedar Rapids years ago. This is just in March of this year in Iowa. Massive flood damage. This is an amazing thing. In Endicott, Maryland, in 2018, there was so much water flowing and flooding behind these buildings that are pouring out of the storefronts. It's just something from a science fiction movie, but it happened in Maryland. It's not just in the U.S. Obviously. Bangladesh, a third of Bangladesh was flooded, and 700,000 homes were either damaged or destroyed. It's almost impossible to imagine. Hiroshima, Japan. I'll skip this. So we talk about floods and rain. You go, yeah, we've seen that, but we've also seen droughts. The exact same process that sucks water out of the ocean because of the additional heat, evaporates water over the ocean, evaporates water from the land, and that results in longer and deeper droughts. And again, these are happening all over the world. This is in Chennai in India. The worst drought in 140 years happened in 2017. Here in Iowa, this was a television broadcast that farmers in southern Iowa experienced the worst drought in 30 years last year. Australian sheep ravaged by drought. According to UNESCO, by 2050, 5 billion people could face water shortages, which is, the majority of people on Earth. You've all, I'm sure, been hearing stories about large cities basically running out of water and having to deal with that kind of emergency. This kind of thing is on the horizon. So in Syria, there were droughts. In 2010, this particular farmer had 400 acres of wheat, but it all turned into a desert. And during that drought, 60% of Syria's fertile land turned into a desert. And that drove 1.5 million people into the already crowded cities. And we're all aware this isn't the only source of the cause of conflict in Syria, but it's one of the major causes. Complete disruption of the society caused to a large extent by drought due to climate change. In Central America, again, we're aware of, how can we not be aware of the issue about immigration from Central America, not just from Mexico. And it's called the dry corridor because the drought-affected areas cover the central part of Central America. In the Global Climate Risk Index, Honduras was ranked first out of 184 countries, and Nicaragua was fourth. So you do hear about the fact that a certain number of the refugees that are headed toward the U.S. border are in part fleeing the ravages of climate change, drought, and so forth. And again, unfortunately, that's only meant to increase. The Lancet's predicted that the world could see up to 1 billion climate migrants. And you can imagine the disruption that is caused by that degree of migration and dislocation of peoples in terms of global stability.
Can you say something about the Global Climate Risk Index? I don't know that.
I don't know a great deal about it. It's obviously a measure of the various degrees but so I can't go into it for you in detail at this time.
I'll look it up.
Yeah. And again, we don't need to talk much about the fires, especially from those either in California or attuned to California. California, but again, it's all over the world. We just don't hear about it as much as we hear about the ones in our own country. So as the world warms, the ice also melts, and we're interested in the ice that exists on the land. Ice that's floating on the ocean doesn't matter, because that's already pressing down the ocean, so to speak, so if it melts, it doesn't actually raise the sea level. But any ice that is on land, Greenland, Antarctica, etc., adds to the water that is in the ocean. So there's a lot of it melting. In Greenland, 3 trillion tons of ice was lost in 14 years. And in Antarctica, 2 trillion tons lost in 16 years. So the seas are rising. Now, the IPCC, which we talked about at the beginning, predicts that we will probably see a 3-degree centigrade rise by the year 2100 without major interventions, which we're certainly not doing at this point. So major urban centers would be inundated. Here's Alexandria, Egypt, a population of 5 million, and what would happen with a 3-degree rise. That's the area of Alexandria that would be flooded. In Shanghai, there are 24 million people living right on the water's edge, and this is what would happen to Shanghai. We could go on and on. Miami with 5 million basically gets completely, most of Florida obviously would have that kind of a problem. Beyond all of this, climate change is also a medical emergency. And among the various reasons, we've already seen some people being afflicted by the heat and so forth, but tropical diseases are on the move. Tropical diseases live in the tropics because that's what they're acclimated to. And as that climate begins to move north and south, they move as well. The number of US mosquito-borne infections increased 10 times in those 12 years, and tick infections doubled. There's been a big surge in tick-borne illnesses in Iowa as well. This is alarming. A baby born in Warsaw, Poland today will inhale the equivalent of 1,000 cigarettes in the first year of his or her life from smog and other air pollutants. And again, the smog and pollutants come either from burning coal or other fossil fuels or from cars, all related to the burning of fuel. 1.24 million people died in 2017 from air pollution in India. 13% of all the deaths in the country. And this is a photo from New Delhi in 2016. We're at risk of losing up to 50% of our land-based species just in this century. That's actually accelerating according to more recent studies. So the prognosis is dire. I said I wouldn't try to scare you, but I had to pile it all on kind of quickly there. The prognosis is dire, and in fact that word dire comes up extremely often. In 1 week, I found this. Discover magazine, the dire new UN climate change report says the Earth has 12 years to take action. The New York Times, the climate outlook is dire, what's next? NPR, what would it take to avert the dire situation? And then the New York magazine, UN says the climate genocide is coming. It's actually worse than that. So this is just a few days of, actually it's like 2 days of headlines. David Attenborough, who I'm sure many of you know, a great naturalist and broadcaster about nature, had this to say at COP24, which is the gathering of climate representatives. If we don't take action, the collapse of our civilizations and the extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon. So as you can see, everybody is striving for a way to express the seriousness of what they are seeing and feeling, especially people like David, who have traveled all over and seen so much. They try to find a way to break through normalcy and say, look, something serious is going on. And David Wallace Wells wrote in the New York Times, it's okay finally to freak out, even reasonable. So it sounds like a doomsday scenario, but it's different from other doomsday scenarios from the past. Well, and the reasons are that a scientific consensus, a very strong consensus, backs it up. It's not just someone claiming that the sky is falling. And we have the ability to avert it. Here's the Pope. He put out an encyclical a couple of years ago. Among other things, he said that doomsday predictions can't be met with irony or disdain. What kind of world do we want to leave to those who come after us, to children who are now growing up? Bill McKibben, again, the founder of 350, he said, stop talking about the threat of climate change. It's here, it's happening. Global warming is the first crisis that comes with a limit. Solve it now or don't solve it. It's not something where we can say, well, we'll get around to it in a few decades or maybe next century. That would be definitely too late. So the IPCC did say that we have just 12, and now it's 11 years, to avert the worst impacts of climate change. They didn't say, as some people wrongly say, that the world's going to end in 12 years. They said that we've got a 12-year window to avert the worst impacts which are otherwise coming. So bold action has to start now. The good news is we can solve this, and fear or worry or ignoring the problem, that all that can be transformed into a commitment to action. So first we'll just briefly look through the technology. This is the graph, love this graph, of world photovoltaic solar installations. You couldn't get much steeper. That's a very encouraging sign. And this is the reverse graph of the cost of solar energy panels. It dropped more than 99% since 1976. So it's like the reverse graph, which is an excellent thing. The US at this time in 2018 had about 56 gigawatts of solar energy, which could power 10 million homes. That's been increasing since then. This is our own Fairfield MUM array, which not only has a 1 megawatt array, but has really advanced battery technology to do storage. It's all over the world. This is in India and in China. Oh, so here's renewable energy in India. You can see how it's going to be taking off. So that's a projection for, what, 2022, which is just right around the corner. So this is a very encouraging graph, because countries like India and China obviously are critical to our success. This is the largest array right now in the world in China. So again, it's happening all over the world. The price of batteries, lithium batteries, is falling rather dramatically, which is necessary to store energy from wind and solar. And again, a projection to 2040 of how much storage capacity we will have globally in terms of batteries. Then we have cars. General Motors said that it believed the future is all electric in 2017. Volvo committed that all new models as of 2019 will be either electric or hybrid, which they are following through on. You can still buy other models that existed before that weren't new in 2019, but all their new ones. Beijing announced that all their gas-powered taxis will be replaced with electric versions. India aiming for an all-electric fleet by 2030. Then on to wind. Wind could supply 40 times our electric needs if we were really tapping it. This is a similar graph to what we saw with solar energy, what's going on with wind capacity. In the entire month of June 2017, Scotland produced 100% of its energy from wind. So there's real possibilities. Here in Iowa, we produce over 37% of our electricity from wind, and that's the highest in the nation. We don't produce the most gigawatts or megawatts of energy, but we produce the largest percentage of the electricity that we use. Now, here we see some of the countries and what they're planning on, what they're doing, what new electric capacity was in 2018. So in China, they still have a big coal appetite, but 53% of their new stuff was from solar and wind. And we look at India, is a better picture. 65% of their new capacity was from solar and wind. And if we look at Europe, 88% was from solar and wind. And then there are other renewables as well, which, yeah. In the US, this is what's happening with coal. It's dropped down to 1979 levels recently, and it's continuing to drop. This is a rather amusing thing. There's a coal mining museum in Kentucky which puts solar panels on their roof, and they're going to save $10,000 a year. So the technology is advancing. It's rather astonishing, but it's not enough. What we need is the will to use it in much higher levels that are adequate to the challenge. I mean, that was all very positive and encouraging, but it is not enough to reverse the trends that we saw earlier. I'm sure you're all aware that in 2015, the Paris Agreement, every single nation on Earth agreed to work together to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. For a while, it was every country on Earth, and then one country, namely ours, decided to withdraw. But the U.S. cannot legally withdraw until the day after the 2020 presidential election. So even if, obviously after the election, the current president is still in charge for a little while, if he were to withdraw, if he were to withdraw, obviously that could be reversed immediately. And you may have heard some of the other candidates saying that one of their first acts will be to rejoin the Paris Agreement. These are the cities around the U.S. that are committed to 100% renewable energy. And these are the handful that have already achieved it. And then the question is, why not our city? Yeah, there's none in Iowa. And Fairfield it has a reputation for one of the greenest or the most progressive cities in Iowa. And there's a lot of opportunity there to really put our money where our mouth is. So a lot of good things are happening, but it's not enough. It's getting more and more dire, actually, even with all the things we just saw. So what more can we do? So there's actions we can take in our individual lives and in our communities. Before we get there, this is the kind of action we don't want to take. I'm not saying we don't want to play golf, but this gives you an image of what too many of us in America and even around the world are doing about climate change. We're aware in the background that something really bad is happening, but we're playing golf. Let's play through this round, or let's do whatever it is we're doing in our lives, because that's just something going on. Someone surely will take care of it somehow. So that's no longer an option. Now, unfortunately, President Trump wants to prevent, we talked earlier about the National Climate Assessment that every 4 years, I believe, comes out with the latest projections of what's going to be happening in the U.S. He wants to remove from it anything farther out than 2040, which will eliminate from the report the truth of what we're facing, because it's an incremental amount of danger, and a lot of the worst is coming after 2040. So that's unfortunate. That's the kind of thing that has to stop. So actions in our individual lives. We believe that this is the most important. This is number one. To learn about the climate crisis and to talk about it with your friends, with parents, coworkers, relatives, whoever. And what you do is you have to connect the dots, because everybody knows the stories. Everybody knows what's happening, the fires, the floods, the droughts, the disruptions, the heat waves. I mean, you all heard Paris just had this unbelievable, or Europe just had this unbelievable heat wave. It just keeps happening. I don't know, and everyone's aware of it. But we don't want to be like the golfers. We want to connect the dots and say these aren't just bizarre random events that are starting to show up in the news. This is something that's coming at us at a rather high velocity. And what we need to do is talk about it. Why do we need to talk about it and connect the dots? That there's actually a trend and a pattern here? Because that's the only way we're going to change something on a fundamental level. Again, those of you who followed the Democratic candidates and the debates and so forth and their positions, unlike 2012, where climate basically was hardly discussed or not discussed at all in the debates or by the candidates, it's one of the paramount things that comes up now in their platforms and in their discussions, and it even showed up for 15 minutes in this last series of debates. So why is that happening? Because the people are putting more and more attention and getting more and more concerned. And that can only happen when we stir the pot together. It's not somebody else who's going to stir the pot. I mean, obviously journalists, the responsible journalists and others are going to help feed the information and so forth. But we have to continue to stir it as well. And there's a lot of reluctance to do that, and that's understandable. It's kind of a bummer. Who wants to talk about that at a party, or when you're with your friends, or when you visit your relatives? But there are ways, you can find ways to do it. Even if it doesn't have to be heavy-handed, it doesn't have to be dogmatic, it's just connecting some dots. And then slowly, not so slowly, it's rather rapidly coming into the consciousness. There's something called the Yale Climate Opinion Assessment, or something along those lines. A group at Yale that continually surveys where the American people are in terms of their awareness of the climate issue and their concern in terms of a primary issue. And that is transformed rapidly in just a short number of years. So the people are changing, and that's up to us. And then one can also make lifestyle changes, and I'm going to say that the more visible the better. And the reason I say that is if I were to put a new light bulb in my closet and no one knew about it, that might, that's fine, that's good, and it might make me feel a little better, but it doesn't stir the pot. Whereas when we do things that are a little bit more visible in any sort of a way, that again becomes kind of a conversation piece. It lets us keep that ball rolling. This is probably the most important thing we can do in the short term, besides knowing about it and talking about it, to vote climate. To support candidates who recognize that the climate crisis is not just one in a long list of priorities or concerns, but it's a critical priority. Just today I was mentioning to someone, I'm not trying to support any particular candidates here, but just things that I happen to notice. Bernie Sanders just came out today with a statement that he is co-sponsoring a resolution to declare a climate emergency in the United States. So these kinds of commitments, and if you read his announcement, he's very, very strong about it. So this is happening more and more, but it's up to us to take this part of it seriously when it comes to voting. In our communities, there's lots of things we can do. We can write letters to the editor. Anybody can do this. I'm sure you all know that anybody can do that. And especially in a town like ours, almost anything you write, if it's decent, would get printed. You can't keep sending the same thing over and over, but you can send something similar periodically, every couple of months or whatever. And we all can add our voice in that way. You can also write op-eds. Some of the papers in Iowa will accept op-eds even from people who don't live in their immediate area. I've done op-eds in the Cedar Rapids Gazette and other places. So you can do both of those, and it's a good thing to do. Bird dogging candidates. Bird dogging just means going to where the candidates are and asking them a strong, carefully worded question. In this case, about the climate and their position on climate and what bold action they would commit to take. You do two things with this. First of all, if they hear it more and more, and they get a sense that it's coming from the people, which it is. And secondly, they have to formulate and tell you where they do stand. Some of them will try to sidestep it, but that's why you have to formulate a good question. Try to think, how can I ask something where you can't just step aside and sort of talk about something else? It's a challenge, but it's something, again, that we all can participate in. We can lobby our existing legislators, city and state leaders, and that goes on. People go up to Des Moines. We could talk to our city councilmen. We can go up and talk to the legislators in Des Moines. We can talk to federal representatives as well. And when you do it in person, it's probably more powerful than when you just write a letter or give them a call. So that's something to consider. And thinking big, we can talk about the Fairfield City Council and why aren't we committing to at least a plan for 100% clean energy? What reason would we have not to do that? Obviously, they can come up with reasons, but given all we've seen tonight, there's really no excuse not to. And the city could also create a plan, a climate mitigation and adaptation plan. Just what is the city doing in general about the kind of changes that are coming because of climate change? But beyond that, we have to have immediate, massive government action at the federal level. Now, there are people who would disagree with this politically, but this is certainly where we stand. That the size of this challenge demands organization at a national level. Again, going back to the IPCC, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, which is an extremely ambitious, that's centigrade, extremely ambitious goal, which most people think is no longer possible, would require rapid and far-reaching transitions in land, energy, industry, buildings, transport, and cities. Once again, you could hardly be more comprehensive and strong than that. But that's what it would take, and you go, well, if it's going to take that, who has the ability to make that happen? They also said this is unprecedented in terms of scale, but it's not necessarily unprecedented in terms of speed. That is, we've done some very fast things before as a nation. One thing we did was this. We've done impossible things before in just a small number of years, technologically speaking. But the moon landing is not the most relevant example from our own history. That would be this. World War II level mobilization of the economy. What we did, because the country dedicated itself to fight a threat, we transformed the economy rapidly. We took automobile plants, stopped making automobiles, and started making airplanes and other vehicles that were needed in the war effort. And everyone got together and just did it. But they didn't do it voluntarily. It was a federally organized and mandated effort. And so you'll hear a lot about a World War II level of mobilization, because there is no other analogy to make these things happen fast enough and in a comprehensive enough way. So what's holding us back, besides other things we've spoken about? In these 16 years, lobbyists spent $2 billion influencing climate-related legislation, whereas the fossil fuel and electric utilities and transportation sectors outspent environmental and renewable groups 10 to 1. So there's a lot of money behind this. This graph, you don't need to read all the little details, but the two green and greenish slices are the ones that renewables and environmental organizations contributed to lobbying efforts. The rest were electrical utilities, fossil fuels, agriculture, etc. And subsidies, people say, well, you've been subsidizing this solar power and electric cars and all this. So renewables have been subsidized to the tune of 143 billion, which is a sizable amount, but fossil fuels have been subsidized to the tune of 5.3 trillion. Now we're talking here about both direct and externalized, subsidies, but these figures came from the International Monetary Fund.
How many years?
37 times bigger. So bold government leadership is required to turn back the carbon economy. We need a fair, strong carbon fee. We won't go into too much detail about this right now, but a carbon fee basically is a fee that's put on the importation or the creation of carbon-related materials, fuels, and that fee goes up every year and gets very, very high as quickly as possible to be a brake and a restriction on the expansion and the use of fossil fuels. Where does that money go? Most plans talk about giving it back to the people. So it's just a pass-through. It's like apply a fee on the producers of carbon, take that money and distribute it every month to all the adults in the United States. So that even though their gas prices are going to go up and so forth, they're getting compensated with all the money that was taken out of it. Yeah, there's so many businesses, Lisa was just saying that the library with their solar array should be complimented. Taco John's did a massive array. It's just amazing. The first one in the United States to do a big solar array right here in Fairfield. Agriplastics is doing a huge one. There's a lot of stuff going on. So what we need is to rapidly eliminate the use of fossil fuels. And that sounds ridiculous, but that's what has to happen. We need strong incentives for renewables, stronger even than we have now. We need intense R&D on renewable energy. It needs to keep getting better and cheaper and more effective. And we need intense R&D on what's called carbon sequestration, which is sucking carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere and putting it into a form that will no longer cause that problem. That's a difficult problem, but so what? We've had other difficult problems that we've solved. And it needs to be an equitable transition, because again, the people that are affected most by this are the people who can least protect themselves, so it's up to us to do this in a way that is equitable. There are many, many more things that could be done. But again, I was focusing so far on things that we could demand that our government begins to implement. But there's this book called Drawdown. This is Paul Hawken on the left. He edited a book that did a study of the dozens, I don't know if it was 100 or it was 80, most effective or most the changes that would give us the biggest effect. And here's the list of the top 10, and some of them are very surprising. The first one is refrigerant management. Apparently, we took care of the ozone problem from refrigerant years ago, but this is not an ozone problem. This is a carbon dioxide and methane and other problems. So there are still problems with refrigerants leaking out and being greenhouse gases, and that's the number one impact that he came up with. Wind turbines, number 2. Reduce food waste. That doesn't mean, oh, you shouldn't throw it away. It means, let's consume the right amount of food and not just overuse. A plant-rich diet as opposed to a meat-rich diet. Saving tropical forests. Educating girls, which probably relates in part to number 7, family planning. Solar farms. Silvopasture is just a way of doing agriculture that involves trees and animals and so forth. Rooftop solar, and there's just many, many more. So there's so many areas that need attention, and to gather them all together and to take truly effective action is going to require the federal government to make that happen. And you're all aware of the Green New Deal. AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Senator Ed Markey announced this a few months ago. The Green New Deal was just basically a position statement about what needs to happen. It's in line with the kind of thing we've been talking about here tonight. It's very bold, and it's a lot of the candidates, especially the Democratic candidates, are endorsing it either completely or to a large degree. And it can be said that a program, and it is said, that a program like the Green New Deal is not practical. She's talking about redoing most of the buildings, that are energy hogs, eliminating fossil fuel energy, on and on. And people will say this is an impractical thing, and even Nancy Pelosi was famous for saying, whatever, that Green New Dream or whatever. So it's not a dream. We don't want to leave it on that. We don't want to put it down like that. It's something that might not seem practical, but there have been so many things we've done before that didn't seem practical. The mobilization for World War II wasn't a practical thing we could just do. Roosevelt's New Deal, which the New Green Deal is named after, wasn't practical. It was kind of revolutionary, but they were necessary at the time, so we did them. And even the Republicans have stepped up in various ways. So the former Secretaries of State James Baker and George Shultz proposed a carbon fee and dividend plan, which Fortune magazine said was the most ambitious climate plan in history. This is like what I spoke about a few minutes ago, where you tax the carbon producers and you keep increasing the tax and feeding the money back to the people just to be a brake and a disincentive and an incentive for alternatives that don't get taxed in that way. There are many movements that are rising up at this time, some of them by young people. The Sunrise Movement is the most prominent of the one that's led exclusively by young people. And they're doing great work. They were involved in the onset of the Green New Deal, and they're all over the country. As far as the youth aspect of it, it's funny, when I was watching an early video of theirs, a broadcast, and on the video it came up saying, click here if you want to become, one of our people or whatever. So I clicked, and then the next thing said, "Are you over 30 years old?" If so, you can be an elder advisor. So this is a youth movement, and that's fantastic. We have, this is not a youth movement, it's run by various people of various ages, and they're obviously playing on the World War II analogy of the climate mobilization. In Europe and in
Oh,
England,
excuse me, and specifically when women went to work and were given jobs that they'd never been allowed to do before because the men went off and fought, and at least the women were allowed to work in factories and really help.
right,
It's part
right.
of how we got it done.
Right, well, and the head of the climate mobilization is a woman, and many of the, actually, so is Sunrise Movement. Varshini Prakash is the young woman who runs the other one. In Europe and in England, what's called the Extinction Rebellion, which sounds a little bit dark, but it's because they're rebelling against our extinction, or against extinction in general. They've done some wild things in England. They shut down some of the major bridges just with waves of people. Some of the people went and basically mooned the parliament and inside the parliament in London. They've done some wild things, but England did make a strong resolution in terms of the climate emergency, in part in response to what they were up to in London. How many of you know Greta Thunberg? Almost everyone. Yeah, she's amazing how she has become known worldwide. So
She's
she was
nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize.
Nobel Prize. Yeah, she was 15 years old when she was invited to speak at Davos, which is the World Economic Forum. And one thing she said there is, "I want you to panic. Our house is on fire." And here we'll listen to just a couple of minutes of Greta.
Adults keep saying we owe it to the young people to give them hope. But I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. And then I want you to act. I want you to act as if you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if the house was on fire. Because it is.
So she's been active all around the world, speaking to parliaments, speaking to various global groups. And she's inspired student strikes. That's how she started, as you probably know. She started out just as a 15 or 14-year-old thinking, this is unacceptable, this is my future, what can I do? And she just, by herself, sat outside the Swedish parliament with a sign saying that she was on strike because of climate change. Once a week she did that, and that led to this worldwide take-up among youth. 1,600 cities walked out in May of 2019. So the IPCC says to our species that this is the moment and we have to act now. Once again, that's a theme of what we're saying tonight, that it has to be now. It's not sometime later when we get around to it or when we finally get motivated. We have to find our way to make an impression now. And there will always be deniers and doubters and resistance, of course. But after the final no, there comes a yes. And on that, the future world depends. This is what the poet Wallace Stevens said. And that's what we're working toward. Because everything we care about depends on it. And that's literally true. Everything we care about on this planet depends on what we start to do now. So you can think about where you might fit in. And just to review what we said, talking about the climate crisis in whatever way is effective for you. Voting climate, absolutely critical, especially as we go into 2020. And taking local action in all the ways we talked about. You also are welcome to join mass actions should they ever develop in our neighborhood or anywhere that you're able to go to. Some of us in our group have participated in a number of these. And we're also here to help. We can customize, I did this presentation this way, but we've done shorter ones, different ones, you know, of all different kinds. So any group that you may be a part of, or even just any gathering of 10 or more people, we'd be happy to present. And on Facebook, if you don't know, it's Climate Action Iowa. And if you follow us, you'll get periodic alerts, just interesting news stories we post every day. And so I don't think Facebook gives you something every day. Does anybody who gets something, not every day, every now and then, you know, it's the unfathomable Facebook algorithms that determine whether you're going to get something or not. But we post multiple times a day, and periodically you'd get some interesting latest event or news. So that's it then, yeah.
I just have a quick little thing that I realized tonight that I can do on a personal level, and that is when we in Iowa keep getting the phone calls, the surveys, the political, surveys, that we could actually answer them or talk to people. They said one of the questions was, "What is the most important thing to you? The most important issue?" And I just automatically came out, well, climate change. And so if you it took 12 minutes to answer their whole question, but it's a way to get your voices registered.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Hey, Tom, you left a wide open gap for me. I'm not dispassionate on this, but right alongside with your actions, take responsibility for your investment dollar, get out of fossil fuel investments, invest into the renewable economy. So just Google, divest, invest. And most importantly, from activism point of view, let's say you have a Vanguard account or a Schwab or TD Ameritrade. You get on your representative and you say, where are the high impact transformative investments? Yeah. They'll come back with a lot of greenwashed stuff. But say, where's the real impact investment? If you don't show it to me, I'm going to move my money. And I guarantee you, Wall Street's hearing this, and they need to get more and more people giving that direction.
Great. Interesting history. Harvard University, which has like one of the largest, endowments and investments in the world.
Mike.
So Harvard University has one of the largest investments, or maybe the largest endowment in the country, billions of dollars, and they have decided and continue to decide not to divest from fossil fuels, even though there's been a lot of activism on campus and so forth. Their position is we're not trying to influence the political process, I mean, we don't live in the world, right? So, that's the kind of thing where the pressure has to continue on all, just like Stuart said, you can, so to speak, pressure your financial advisors, you can pressure your colleges, you can pressure almost everybody.
I'm really sad to see how bad golf is for the climate. But then I got excited because I see where I can fit into this. So I'm pledging right now, in my next round of golf, to hit as few golf shots as possible, including as few putts as possible. And I'm asking all the golfers to join me in trying to shoot as few golf shots as possible in all of our rounds.
I'm curious why, like thorium nuclear reactors are not part of the solution, because thorium reactors are much safer, the waste is much less. The U.S. is sitting on the biggest thorium deposits in the world, and this is a solution that provides constant energy. The wind stops, the sun goes down.
I'm going to have to speak against that.
Okay.
All right, that is not a well-founded notion. All right, we don't need nuclear of any kind anymore. The waste stream, even with thorium, is a lethal problem, and it is no longer necessary. I mean, we've already seen this.
Well, wait a minute. It's no longer necessary if you have huge conversion to solar and wind, but that's not going to happen that easily.
Really? Why not?
Well, because of the numbers, okay? The numbers, because the numbers, if you look at the numbers, the total global capacity that's needed, it's staggering. And so it's great, everyone gets an electric car, but where does the electricity come from?
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing up nuclear, because one of the reasons that we don't feature it in this presentation is because it is highly, highly controversial, even among people who are extreme advocates for doing something about climate change. So, but it's something that we personally spend time continuing to learn about, and we just haven't ourselves come to a consensus yet. That's why it's not here, but I appreciate you bringing it up, and you all are more than encouraged to continue to explore the possibilities of the thorium nuclear reactors, even, not you though, Patrick.
Been there, done that. It's not a good idea.
For the last 2 years, I've lived off the grid about 85% of the time. I'm having a wonderful time. My utility bill right now is zero. It's zero. The water is taken care of. There's two things we're not paying attention to. I've got a 20-degree sleeping bag. I sleep like a baby at 20 degrees. I sleep very well at 20 degrees. I really do. And
Is it 20 degrees in your house sometimes?
oh yeah, a lot colder than that. New Year's.
Is that Celsius? Yeah, I was going to ask, is that Celsius or Fahrenheit?
I worked for Community Water Supply back in 1961. We knew then that gasoline was going to cost less per gallon than potable water in our lifetimes, and that's exactly where we're going. 60 million people run out of water in India just next year. And you've got to deal with water, you've got to quit using energy. You don't just have to convert it all to something and be comfortable at 72 degrees. That's bullshit. It's just absolute bull. So get comfortable, get inside your skin, go for a walk in warm clothes, and gosh, you're toasty at 40 degrees. You're very toasty. So please get serious about finding out about living in your body in this world.
Can you say something more about refrigeration? Like, how does somebody, do they change their refrigerator to some other type of refrigerator?
I don't know whether there's a lot of viable options right now. I mean, certainly not in the commercial market, the typical refrigerators. But I think the idea there was more to once again mandate the change in the type of coolant or compressor fluid that they're using so that the coming generations will not have that problem. But I don't know the answer to the question as to whether there are options right now that you could actually buy. David.
Thank you. A couple of things. I was uncomfortable with some of the information that was presented, projections to 2050 and to the end of the century. We don't have that long, and that's very apparent. And one of the reasons it's apparent that you didn't mention is that the oceans are warming. One of the things that keeps water at a temperature is having ice in it. And when the ice has melted, then the heating occurs much more rapidly and the changes are much more dramatic. Earlier this year, we've seen presentations on the disappearance of the polar ice, the floating ice, not the ice that's on land-based. And the result of that is that we have less ice to keep the water at a steady temperature. So warming is going to accelerate. Yes. And some of the measures you're suggesting sound like they're aimed at something a little shorter than 30 or 40 years out. You know, Trump wants to limit the projections to 2040. In some sense, I'm saying, like, yeah, what difference does it make? We've got to take action before then. We've got to completely turn the thing around before 2040, or it's going to simply be too late.
We absolutely do. The only point there was, if you look at the problem with the greenhouse gases is they're cumulative. Except for methane, which does degrade much more rapidly than carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide sticks around for a very long time and has its effects. So it gets worse and worse. So even though you're right, there's enough problems in 2030. We don't have to think about 2100, but it takes a lot to motivate some people. And that's why people are looking out, where are we really headed?
It seems too remote, though.
Yeah, that's a challenge, you're right. Yeah.
So all we've been talking about is production of CO2. We haven't said much about sequestration of CO2. I just read something that said, it gave an actual number of trees if we planted, it would sequester 40% of the CO2 that we've got up there now. So plant trees.
It was, just to be clear about that.
I thought don't forget going to Mars, plant some damn trees.
It's they're talking about 2 trillion trees, by the way, so that's a, it's
we put
a,
92 in the.
there you go, 92, that's a start. Absolutely, trees are beautiful, but that's a plan that has got a lot of traction recently, just in the last week, but it's a massive undertaking to plant 2 trillion.
So is making
You have to
lots
water
of
them, you
solar.
don't just plant them, you have to take care of them for
Right.
years.
Tom,
They don't take care of themselves.
I just want to make the point that the choir is here. Where are the other people? Okay. Next point on that is that there's a PBS interview this last week. I think it's a guy's name, Arthur Brooks, who is a chairman of like the Institute for Competitive Enterprise, not a liberal think tank. Has written a book called Love Your Enemies or something like that. That was when my phone went off. I was trying to search for that. His point is that people on various sides of issues, and this is a hot one, right, usually assume that there's more hate in the other person than there really is. And so therefore, we on our side build up our own wall, and we can't talk, or we start out with a punch, right? And so his main thesis is you have to realize these are people, they love their families just as much as you. You have to show them love and then talk. And this is the only way to get those people to listen, is to realize that we have actual commonality, that we're not their enemies, that we have a common problem, and that we will listen to their points of view and then share ours.
Good.
I'm wondering what to do about the car I drive. I'm driving a 15-year-old car. It was given to me by my mother. It's a lovely car, but it's, a real gas burner. It's a, 6 engine. I don't want to sell the car because I don't drive the car very much. I don't want to sell it because someone else will drive it a lot more. So what do I do about this? Because eventually I'm not going to be able to drive this. I want to get an electric car, but they're not quite where I want them to be yet. And so what do I do about this? What if my car totally sort of gives out on me? And then what do I do with this car?
Well, if it gets out on you, then you don't have the problem of somebody driving it too much, right?
You sell it by pressure.
But do I want to sell it for parts to enrich somebody else's broken car and keep this kind of thing going? See, it's a conundrum I play with.
Maybe somebody has
the answer. What do I do about the car?
Yeah, I've been playing with this. I drive like a 1992 Geo Metro, which gets 47 miles a gallon and costs $5,000 new. That's not rocket science to make cars that get a lot of mileage per hour. But it's getting older, and some of my friends are saying, yeah, got to get rid of that, right? I like it. But it's going to age before I do. But I'm developing these things of, like, I have friends, younger friends, who have like a Prius or something like that. And I offered to my young friend who's 30 years old, I said, hey, listen, once a month or so, could I use your car to go to Iowa City? Oh, sure, he said. So car sharing is something we could start doing in Fairfield.
Good idea.
So, that could be part of this. That could be part of this group is to share cars that get higher miles per gallon and not have to spend so much on insurance, etc.
I have to say I've never heard that particular question before, so I don't have a particular answer. Does anybody?
I think I do. There's this notion of life cycle costing. It's far better to keep your old car who gets 15 miles per gallon than go out and buy, a new car that took X amount of raw materials.
It's not
so
about the gas.
it's reduce, reuse, and recycle.
Amen.
Right?
Keep it tuned up.
And reduce is the biggest one. So buy a bicycle And you use that
Really bad nasal.
an electric power assist bicycle will allow you to use a bicycle. And then just use your car when you need it, when it's raining or it's too cold or whatever.
Would you get tuned up so that it works really
Well,
efficiently?
no, it does. I do all that. But it still emits a lot because it's a big engine.
But if you're selling the car because you want the new sexy 50
No,
mile a gallon
that's
thing,
not- that's
you're
not-
actually driving the hungry caterpillar of consumption.
Yeah. No, I agree with that totally. I'm just trying to figure out what to do when the car actually dies. Oh, really? Okay. All right, so that's a possibility. All right.
Well, here's something that we can do, because we may not be able to completely reduce the carbon that we produce, but if we pay a small amount, and it's a shockingly small amount, to actually reduce the amount of carbon that we emit somewhere else, then we've effectively reduced our carbon to zero. It doesn't take us off the hook for being careful and car sharing and all the other things we've talked about. But it's a real deal. And blanking on the name, Stuart, you remember the...
Native energy has got carbon offsets.
Well, you got lots of carbon offsets. But I like to use, there's a particular, and I'll find and give it to you, Tom. There's a particular organization that plants forests, plants trees, very strategically, only in a few places in the U.S. because in those places the sequestration is maximized.
Wow.
And some of it is in California, some of it in the southeastern pine forest. But you can pay, piddly amount, $100, $150 a year, and effectively with their, and this is all absolutely validated. I mean, it's done in a way that you can absolutely be assured that if you buy that kind of offset, you're
I do think that's...
So Bob, send me that info and I'll post it on Climate Action.
I think that's TerraPass, and then Native Energy will invest in renewable energy generation with your offset. So you can choose tree planting or renewable energy through those two organizations.
Sorry, I had Diane.
So this was a really great presentation, and it focused, to me, it's focused primarily on fossil fuels as being one of the major contributors, which it is. But the more I'm reading about climate change, agriculture plays a huge role in this whole problem as well. And knowing what I know about industrial ag and both crop farming and CAFOs and all of that, that's a real energy hog, those things. So do you have like some figures, because I don't really have figures right now, how much agriculture contributes compared to like fossil fuels, and how much the Climate Action Iowa is really focusing on that aspect as well?
Good. The thing with agriculture is part of their impact is due to the fact that they use a certain amount of fossil fuels with all their big machinery and so forth. So you have to, it gets a little tricky to separate their use of fossil fuels from the other impacts they have. But we do have some statistics. We haven't been focusing on it. Maybe we're afraid to do so in Iowa. I don't know. But I'm not afraid. But obviously we want to deliver the message to as many as we can. But no, it's good, Diane. We should see about increasing that emphasis.
Yeah, because Tom, the other thing is regenerative agriculture sequesters carbon, and it actually could be as good or better than planting trees, and that's how you produce food. It's a triple win, and that's a tough sell in Iowa with corn and soybean rotations everywhere. But I think all of us could at least be aware of the fact that there are farmers practicing it already, and we could draw enough carbon out of the atmosphere with proper regenerative agriculture practice to be going a long way to actually getting out of crisis mode at least.
Yeah, that's good. I think we should, along with agriculture's impact, we should focus a little bit more on sequestration strategies, and farming is definitely one of them. Who hasn't spoken yet?
In past years, I read complaints that we wouldn't be able to transfer all the way over to solar because of the use or the need for rare earths and other ingredients. That there just wasn't enough of them in the batteries and arrays and wherever they were to actually be able to do it. So could I have an update on that?
I'm not a complete expert by any means on this, on the rare earths and the metals that are required in some of these technologies, but I am aware that they are continually working on inventions to use other kinds of materials that are less rare and less problematic in other ways. That doesn't mean it's a slam dunk, but it's part of that technological process. I'm not aware of there being an absolute limit that anyone's talking about at this point.
Okay, I have a comment and a question. One is, earlier in the presentation, you talked about bird dogging candidates or bird dogging, anyone on the question about talking more about climate change. So this is an opportunity for everybody here. When candidates come to Fairfield, when candidates come to Ottumwa or Mount Pleasant, you can point, ask them questions about climate change and where they stand. And I got an email from Ed Fallon, who's, was really big on the Bakken pipeline. He walked the entire length of the pipeline throughout Iowa. And he asked me to go bird dog somebody in Ottumwa, but anyway, turns out I just didn't have the time, and I'm intending on doing it. So the other thing is, the whole point of that is to get it to be a debate on a national level for the Democratic candidates, to talk about this on a national level, and something about the DNC not wanting to do that and not wanting to go there. So maybe, Tom, you know a little bit about that.
Two things. One is Paul Hawken had number 4 up there about a plant diet because of all the methane that's produced by cows in particular, cattle. And there is a major connection, and that some people say that as much fossil fuels, CO2 or methane comes, is as high from agriculture as it is from the whole electrical and other needs. The other thing I wanted to share is it's been mentioned about the resolution that Bernie and AOC recently did, and the whole thing about the new Green Deal. What I wanted to share is that about 2 years ago, or at least in the last session of Congress, the OFF Act was introduced, Off Fossil Fuels Act, and it's very comprehensive, and more so even than what's being proposed or floated so far. It was endorsed by about 400 environmental organizations, and it was proposed by Tulsi Gabbard, and she either has or is about to reintroduce this into the current Congress.
Yeah, that's great. And more of those kind of endeavors are what we have to make happen. Bruce?
Yeah, I have one more idea, but I want to actually float in front of the group to get your opinion. We were just talking about, the fact that we're the choir, and there's other groups, other types of people who don't want to listen, partly because we're a bunch of liberals and communists, and they're, correct. And one of my ideas is that in every advertisement that we or you that we put out, we should include an American flag on it. Because it's from now on, it's motherhood, apple pie, and the environment, right? So I just want, how many people feel that would be a guttural strong statement? Right.
We should put God in there too.
Well, I think it's very awful that the Republicans seem to have co-opted our flag.
Right.
How
Yeah,
did
that's
that
the
happen?
point. Yeah.
But it's now their flag. How come the Democrats don't get that?
I want to talk about like the city, in terms of getting the city to become like a renewable city. This past year I looked at getting solar put on my house, and I've got too many trees, so I was not a candidate for solar. But, apparently in some places you can have these solar arrays that are set up, and you connect into those arrays somehow, and without having to have it on your house. And it requires, from what I understand, a municipal utility to be able to do this. Now, a number of years ago, Bob, you might remember, we talked about, getting a municipal utility set up here in Fairfield, and there were roadblocks to doing that. But I wonder how feasible it is to reconsider that, and see if that's something that could be done, so that many of us that may not be able to put solar on our homes can still contribute in a way that reduces our footprint in that way, and it helps us get to that totally renewable city. Have any discussions gone on recently?
I mean, it was probably a year or so ago that it was actually arose again, and that's in Fairfield. That's because, in part, Decorah was making a very strong push to become a municipal utility. They had some very strong organizers up there and done a lot. Unfortunately, Alliant did more, and in terms of convincing the voters, and so it lost by a very small margin. So it's discouraging for Decorah. That doesn't mean it's the end of the road, but you can bet that the utilities will do everything they can to fight these kind of things.
What about convincing the utilities to do it? Is that ridiculous? I mean,
the point of a municipal utility as such is that you are your own thing and they're getting nothing from you. They've just lost Fairfield, all the revenue in Fairfield, forever. We are our own generator, and so that's not really advantageous to a profit-oriented company like Alliant.
Couldn't we change to a co-op and have the other co-op down south end of town?
Well, Alliant has a contract with Fairfield, but anyway, Bob, you want to say something?
How do we get out of it?
Well, to some extent, this is already happening. The 1 megawatt array, 1.1 megawatt array with a 1 megawatt hour battery, that is now a third of MUM, is a really good example of what can happen. And what Roger Voorhees did with a half a megawatt that runs his operation, and Agroplastics is doing that. One of the things that may happen, you didn't hear it from me, but one of the things that may happen is that there are so many of the large loads that are going to go off the Alliant system that it may be that Alliant at some point will decide that they just as soon sell the grid to Fairfield, and it might be more possible. So that may be something that happens in the future.
that would be good.
All right. Thank you all so much for coming.